He slapped her so hard, the sound cut through the diner like a gunshot. And no one moved. Not because they didn't care,
I said, give me
but
the
because
money.
they were afraid. In a quiet lakeside town in Montana, fear had become the law no one wrote down, but everyone obeyed.
No, no more.
People kept their heads low, their voices softer, their courage buried somewhere they could no longer reach. The man smiled after hitting her, like it meant nothing, like he owned the room and everyone in it.
Are you okay?
But the woman he struck
It's gonna
didn't
be all
fall.
right.
She didn't scream. She simply looked at him, calm, unbroken. Because what he didn't
What are you
know
doing here?
was that she
Just
wasn't
passing through.
alone. At that
Where's
exact
this at?
moment, the diner door was
no
about to
idea.
open, and her son, a Navy SEAL, was walking in, with a trained Belgian Malinois at his side. One slap. That's all it took, to awaken
What did you
something
just
this
say?
town had forgotten.
Move.
Before we begin, please let us know where you're watching from. And if stories of courage and justice move you, sign up to see more. Grayport, Washington did not greet the morning so much as endure it, as if the town itself had grown tired of expecting anything better from the world beyond its gray horizon, where the Pacific stretched cold and indifferent beneath a sky the color of worn steel, and the wind came in steady breaths off the water, carrying salt, damp wood, and the faint rusted scent of a harbor that had once been alive with louder dreams. The docks creaked softly as if remembering better days, while fishing boats rocked in patient silence, their hulls chipped and repainted too many times to count. And along the narrow main street, storefronts stood shoulder to shoulder like old men who had learned to survive not by speaking, but by watching. Because in Grayport, survival had slowly become a quiet agreement. Do not ask, do not resist, and above all, do not be noticed. It was a place shaped less by storms than by the long, invisible pressure of something heavier than weather, something that had settled into the bones of its people over the past 2 years, ever since Everett Sloan arrived with promises polished smooth enough to reflect hope, yet sharp enough to cut it away when no one was looking. Everett Sloan was not a man the town saw often, but his presence lingered everywhere like a shadow cast by money rather than light. He was in his early 50s, tall, composed, with neatly combed silver hair and a face that carried the calm confidence of someone accustomed to being believed, his voice measured and warm in public meetings, his suits always immaculate, his words always careful. Yet beneath that surface lived a patience that was not kindness, but calculation. The kind of patience that waited for resistance to tire itself out. People said he smiled often, but never with his eyes, and over time, Grayport had learned that the most dangerous men were not the loud ones, but the ones who made silence feel like a reasonable choice. And so the town adjusted, slowly at first, then all at once, as properties along the shoreline began to change hands, as old families packed their lives into trucks without much explanation, as conversations in diners grew shorter and glances toward the door grew quicker, because everyone understood, even if no one said it aloud, that saying no had become expensive in ways that did not always involve money. Lorraine Hale stepped into that morning, as she had stepped into countless others, with a steadiness that did not come from strength alone, but from the quiet refusal to let the world decide what she would become. At 81, she was small in frame, her shoulders slightly rounded with age, yet there was nothing fragile about the way she carried herself, because time had not diminished her so much as distilled her into something simpler and harder to move. Her silver hair was gathered neatly at the back of her head, her pale blue eyes clear despite the years, and the lines across her face did not speak of weakness, but of endurance. She had lived most of her life in Grayport, had watched the harbor rise and fall with the tides of fortune, had buried her husband more than a decade ago after a long winter illness that left her alone in the cedar house overlooking the water. And though grief had settled into her life like a permanent season, it had never bent her will, because Lorraine belonged to a kind of people who believed that dignity was not something given by the world, but something held quietly, even when the world tried to take it away. That house, perched just above the shoreline with its weathered wood and narrow porch facing the sea, was more than property to her. It was memory made solid. The place where her husband had built each wall with his own hands, where laughter had once filled rooms now softened by silence, where her son had grown before leaving for a life that rarely allowed him to stay long. And when Everett Sloane's offers began arriving, polite at first, then persistent, then edged with something less negotiable, Lorraine had answered each one the same way. No. Not now. Not ever. It was not defiance for the sake of pride, nor stubbornness born of ignorance, but something quieter, something rooted in the understanding that some things, once surrendered, could never be returned, and that a life measured only by convenience was not a life she intended to finish living. The bell above the door of the Harbor Diner rang softly as she entered, the familiar sound cutting gently through the low hum of morning conversation. And inside, the warmth wrapped around her like a memory that had been kept alive through repetition rather than novelty. The smell of coffee and fried eggs lingering in the air, sunlight filtering weakly through slightly fogged windows, and the checkered floor worn smooth by years of footsteps that had followed the same patterns day after day. Behind the counter stood Megan Brooks, a woman in her late 20s with sandy blonde hair tied loosely at the back of her head and a face that still carried traces of youthful brightness, though it had been tempered by responsibility that had arrived earlier than expected. Megan had grown up in Greyport, had once spoken often of leaving for the city, of finding something larger than the quiet routine of a coastal town. But life had shifted its course when her father's injury left him unable to work, anchoring her to the diner and to a role she had not chosen, but accepted with a kind of quiet resilience. She was kind in the way that came from habit rather than effort, moving quickly between tables, remembering orders without writing them down, offering small smiles that asked for nothing in return. Yet beneath that kindness lived a careful awareness, a habit of watching the room in the same way others did now, measuring who had entered, who had left, and who might cause trouble if not handled gently. "Morning, Lorraine," Megan said, her voice soft but steady, already reaching for a mug before the older woman had even sat down, because routine had replaced the need for questions long ago. Lorraine returned the greeting with a slight nod, settling into her usual seat by the window, where she could see a narrow slice of the harbor between buildings, the water shifting restlessly under the gray sky. And for a moment, the world felt almost unchanged, as if the years had folded in on themselves and left only the parts she wished to remember. But Greyport had changed, even if it pretended not to, and that change lived not in what people said, but in what they avoided, in the way conversations paused when certain names were mentioned, in the way doors closed a little quicker than before. Outside, a truck passed slowly along the street, its engine low and deliberate, and though no one inside the diner turned to look, everyone heard it, because in a place like this, sound carried meaning long before it carried attention. Lorraine wrapped her hands around the warm mug Megan placed before her, the heat seeping gently into her fingers, and she allowed herself a brief moment of stillness, the kind that felt almost like peace if one did not look too closely at it. Because peace, in Greyport, had become something fragile. Not broken, but held together by the quiet agreement that it was better not to test how easily it could be. And in that silence, that careful, practiced silence, the town continued as it always had, not yet aware that something had already begun to shift beneath its surface, something that would not remain quiet forever.
And the most important thing I learned overseas was resilience. You have to adapt, overcome, and stay focused on the mission, no matter the challenges.
The morning in Greyport did not grow brighter as the hours passed. It only grew more awake. And with that awareness came a tension that moved quietly through the streets like a tide that never quite reached the shore. As if the town itself sensed something approaching but had already decided, long ago, that sensing was safer than reacting. Inside Harbor Diner, the rhythm of plates, cutlery, and low conversation continued with practiced precision. The kind of routine that existed, not because life was peaceful, but because routine was the only way to pretend it still could be. Lorraine Hale sat by the window as she always did, her posture composed, her hands steady around the coffee mug that Megan had refilled without asking, and for a brief moment, it almost seemed as if nothing would disturb the fragile balance of the morning. But balance, like glass, rarely announces the moment before it breaks. The bell above the diner door rang, sharper this time, cutting through the room with a tone that did not belong to ordinary arrivals. And though no one turned immediately, a subtle shift moved through the space, as if every person present had felt the same quiet warning at once. Then the door opened wider, and Darius Crow stepped inside. Darius Crow was a man built not only in size, but in presence, the kind that filled a room before he spoke a single word. He was in his early 40s, broad through the shoulders, with a heavy frame that suggested strength without discipline, his dark hair slicked back carelessly, as if he valued speed over precision, and a rough stubble covered his jaw, giving him a permanent look of impatience. His eyes were small, sharp, and constantly moving, not with curiosity, but with calculation, scanning for weakness rather than connection. And there was something in the way he walked, slow but deliberate, that carried the confidence of someone who had learned that consequences rarely reached him. People in Greyport knew him not because he introduced himself, but because he did not need to. He was Everett Sloane's messenger, though no one used that word aloud, a man who turned polite offers into final decisions. And though he rarely raised his voice, the results of his visits were always the same. The room did not fall silent immediately, but it softened, as if the volume of every conversation had been gently lowered by an invisible hand. And Megan's movements behind the counter slowed just enough to betray the tension she tried to hide, her eyes flicking once toward Lorraine before returning to the coffee pot she held too tightly. Darius did not look at anyone else. He walked straight toward Lorraine. Each step seemed louder than it should have been, not because of the sound itself, but because of the attention it carried. And by the time he reached her table, every person in the diner was aware of what was about to happen, even if they refused to admit it. "Mrs. Hale," he said, his voice smooth in a way that felt rehearsed rather than genuine, as he rested one hand against the edge of the booth, leaning slightly forward as if they were about to share a private conversation, though his tone carried easily across the room. "We've been trying to reach you." Lorraine looked up at him without haste, her pale blue eyes steady, her expression unchanged, and in that moment, she did not appear smaller than him, nor weaker, but simply unmoved, as if the difference in their size belonged to a different kind of measurement entirely. "I received your letters," she replied, her voice quiet but clear, the kind of voice that did not need volume to be heard. "My answer hasn't changed." Darius smiled, but it was not a smile that warmed anything, only one that revealed how little patience remained behind it. He straightened slightly, glancing around the diner as if acknowledging the audience he knew was listening. And for a moment, his eyes passed over Megan, then over the other customers, each glance brief but deliberate, a silent reminder that this was not just a conversation, but a demonstration. "You're holding on to something that doesn't make sense anymore," he said, his tone shifting, the softness thinning into something sharper. "That house, that land, it's part of something bigger now. Progress doesn't wait for sentiment." Lorraine's hands remained still around her mug. "Progress," she repeated softly, as if testing the word for weight, then set the cup down with care before meeting his gaze again. "Is not always improvement." A few heads lowered at nearby tables, not because they disagreed, but because agreement had become dangerous. Darius exhaled through his nose, a short, controlled sound that carried irritation more than anger, and for a brief second, the thin line of control he maintained slipped just enough to reveal the impatience beneath. "You've been given a fair offer," he said, more firmly now. "More than fair. Most people would have taken it by now." "I am not most people," Lorraine answered. The words did not rise, did not challenge, but they did not bend either. And that was enough. The shift happened quickly, almost too quickly for anyone to react, as Darius's expression hardened, the performance dropping away to reveal something more direct, more familiar, the kind of response Greyport had learned to expect when refusal replaced cooperation. His hand moved without warning, the motion sharp and unhesitating, and the sound of the slap cut through the diner with a force that seemed louder than it should have been, echoing briefly against the walls before disappearing into a silence so complete it felt unnatural. Lorraine's head turned slightly with the impact, her body absorbing the motion rather than resisting it. And for a moment, the only movement in the room was the slow settling of her posture as she returned to stillness, a faint red mark rising across her cheek, stark against her pale skin. No one stood. No one spoke. Megan froze behind the counter, the coffee pot still in her hand, her knuckles pale from the pressure of her grip, her eyes wide not with surprise, but with something deeper, something closer to anger that had nowhere safe to go. At a nearby table, an older man named Harold Finch, a retired fisherman whose hands still carried the shape of decades spent pulling nets from cold water, lowered his gaze to his plate, his shoulders tightening slightly as if he had felt the blow himself, yet he remained seated because Harold had once spoken up, years earlier, during a different dispute, and had learned that speaking did not always lead to change, only to consequences that lasted longer than the moment itself. Darius let his hand fall back to his side, his breathing steady, his expression already smoothing back into something controlled, as if the act had been nothing more than a necessary adjustment. That, he said quietly, his voice no longer needing to carry, is what happens when people make things harder than they need to be. Lorraine did not respond immediately. She remained seated, her chin lifting just slightly as she turned her face back toward him, and though the mark remained visible, there was no fear in her eyes, only the same quiet clarity she had carried into the room. "My answer," she said, her voice softer now but no less certain, "is still no." For a moment, something flickered in Darius's expression. Not doubt, not hesitation, but recognition, as if he understood that force, for all its usefulness, could not always achieve what it intended, and yet he stepped back anyway, his gaze sweeping once more across the diner, taking in the silence he had created, the stillness he had reinforced. "Suit yourself," he muttered, turning toward the door with the same deliberate pace he had entered, his presence lingering even as the bell rang again behind him, and the cold air slipped briefly into the room before the door closed. The diner remained quiet long after he was gone. Not because people had nothing to say, but because they had too much. Lorraine reached for her cup again, her hand steady despite the tremor that lingered beneath the surface, and Megan finally moved, stepping out from behind the counter with hesitant steps, her voice barely above a whisper as she asked if Lorraine was all right. Lorraine gave a small nod. "I've had worse winters," she said, a faint hint of something almost resembling humor touching her tone, though it did not reach her eyes. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the diner returned to motion, conversations restarting in fragments, cutlery moving again against plates, the ordinary sounds of life resuming as if nothing had happened, yet everything had changed. Because in Greyport, the most dangerous thing was not the violence itself, it was the silence that followed. The silence left behind in Harbor Diner did not fade so much as settle, like dust after something heavy had struck the ground, and though voices slowly returned in low, uncertain fragments, the weight of what had happened remained suspended in the air, pressing gently against every movement, every glance, every word that dared to rise above a whisper. Lorraine Hale sat where she had been, her posture unchanged, her dignity intact despite the mark still visible along her cheek, and Megan moved carefully between tables now, her usual rhythm slightly broken, as if each step required a decision rather than habit. Outside, the wind had picked up, pushing against the diner windows with a low, steady pressure, and the harbor beyond shifted under its influence, waves striking wood in uneven patterns that echoed faintly through the structure, as though the town itself was restless, aware of something approaching, even if it did not yet know what form it would take. Then, the bell above the door rang again. This time, no one pretended not to notice. The sound was the same, but the reaction was different, because after what had just happened, every new arrival carried the possibility of continuation, of escalation, of something worse. A few heads turned. Others remained still but listened more closely. Megan paused mid-step, her hand hovering over a plate she had been about to set down. The door opened slowly, not with force, not with hesitation, but with a controlled ease that seemed deliberate in its restraint. Grayson Hale stepped inside. He was 37, tall and lean with a frame shaped not by size but by discipline, the kind of build that suggested efficiency over display, and he wore a green Navy SEAL uniform that sat naturally on him, not as something new or ceremonial, but as something worn often enough to become part of his presence. His dark brown hair was cut short in a clean military style, and a neatly trimmed beard framed a face that carried no excess expression, only a quiet alertness that rested behind steady eyes. Those eyes did not rush. They moved once across the room, taking in everything without appearing to search for anything, as if he had already learned long ago that the most important details rarely announce themselves. Beside him moved Onyx. The German Shepherd was 6 years old, large but lean, his black and tan coat clean and dense, muscles visible beneath it with each controlled step. And his amber eyes held a focus that was neither aggressive nor relaxed, but something in between, a readiness that belonged to a creature trained to act only when necessary. His ears stood upright, catching sound before it fully formed. And though he made no noise, his presence carried weight, the quiet kind that did not demand attention, yet drew it all the same. He stayed close to Grayson's left side, not pulling, not lagging, moving in perfect alignment as if the space between them had long ago disappeared. The door closed behind them, and for a moment, the diner did not breathe. Grayson did not speak. He did not ask questions. He simply stood there for a second longer than necessary, allowing the room to settle around him, allowing whatever had just occurred to reveal itself in the subtle details that lingered after action. The tension in shoulders, the way eyes avoided certain directions, the faint tremor in Megan's hand as she set down a plate, the stillness of Lorraine at the window. Then his gaze found her. It did not linger on the room after that. He walked forward. Each step was quiet but carried intention, the kind that came from knowing exactly where one was going before beginning to move. And Onyx followed without command, his posture steady, his eyes scanning not randomly, but with quiet precision, noting movement, noting space, noting the absence of sound where sound should have been. At a nearby table, Harold Finch lifted his head slightly, his weathered eyes narrowing as he watched the man approach, something like recognition flickering beneath the surface. Not of identity, but of type, because men like Grayson did not belong to towns like Greyport. And when they appeared, they rarely came without reason. Behind the counter, Megan exhaled slowly, though she had not realized she had been holding her breath, her eyes moving between Lorraine and the approaching figure, uncertainty giving way to something else, something quieter, something closer to hope, though she would not have called it that aloud. Grayson reached the table and stopped. He did not look at anyone else. He looked at Lorraine. Up close, the mark along her cheek was clearer, the faint swelling beneath it catching the light from the window, and though her expression remained composed, there was no mistaking what had happened. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Grayson's voice came, low and even, carrying no urgency, no visible anger, only a calm that felt deliberate. "Are you hurt?" Lorraine studied him for a brief second, her eyes moving across his face as if measuring something beyond appearance, beyond familiarity. And though time had passed since she had last seen him, recognition settled quietly, not as surprise, but as certainty. "I've been worse," she replied. It was not dismissal. It was truth. Grayson gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if the answer had been sufficient, as if it had confirmed something he already understood. Onyx shifted slightly at his side, his body lowering just enough to rest, though his gaze remained forward, focused on the room behind them, on the subtle movements that continued despite the attempt at normalcy. The diner watched. Not openly, not directly, but through reflections in glass, through lowered eyes that lifted just enough to see because something had changed again, not in the loud way Darius had changed it, but in a quieter, more difficult way, one that did not rely on fear to hold attention. Grayson reached for the chair across from Lorraine and pulled it out slowly, the sound of wood against tile soft but distinct in the stillness, and he sat. No announcement, no confrontation, just presence, and somehow that was enough. Because the space he occupied did not bend to the same rules the town had learned to follow, and that difference, subtle as it was, began to ripple outward, touching the edges of a place that had long ago decided not to resist. Outside, the wind continued its steady push against the harbor, waves striking wood, gulls circling above the water, and life moved on as it always had. But inside Harbor Diner, something had shifted. Not broken, not yet, but shifted. And for the first time in a long while, the silence that filled the room did not belong entirely to fear. Greyport did not change overnight, not in any way that could be seen from the outside, because towns like this rarely did. They held on to their habits the way old wood held on to salt, absorbing pressure slowly until the damage could no longer be ignored. And though the streets looked the same that morning, the same narrow sidewalks damp from ocean mist, the same fishing boats rocking against their moorings, the same low clouds pressing down over the harbor, something beneath the surface had begun to shift, subtle but undeniable, like a tide turning long before the shoreline noticed. Grayson Hale stood near the edge of the docks, the green of his Navy SEAL uniform muted under the gray light, blending into the worn textures of wood and water rather than standing apart from them. And beside him, Onyx remained still, his posture relaxed at a glance, but alert in the details, ears flicking at distant sounds, eyes tracking movement along the harbor with quiet precision. The dog had already mapped the rhythms of this place in a way most people never would, noting which footsteps belonged, which engines came too often, which voices carried tension beneath their words. Grayson watched the town the same way, not as a place, but as a pattern. And patterns, once broken, always revealed something. Behind him, footsteps approached, light but purposeful, and though he did not turn immediately, he had already marked the pace, the direction, the absence of hesitation. "Nobody stands out here this long unless they're waiting for something," a woman's voice said, calm but edged with curiosity that had not yet learned to be cautious. Grayson turned then. Natalie Pierce stood a few feet away, hands tucked into the pockets of a worn brown coat that had seen more seasons than it should have. Her posture straight despite the wind tugging at loose strands of her dark auburn hair. She was 31, slender but not fragile. Her features sharp in a way that suggested attention rather than vanity, and her gray eyes carried a restless intelligence that rarely settled, always searching, always connecting pieces that others overlooked. There was a faint tension in her expression, not fear, but the residue of too many unanswered questions, the kind that had followed her for years since she had first started writing for the small local paper. And before that, long before that, when her older brother lost his share of family land under circumstances no one in town could fully explain, a quiet loss that had shaped her into someone who no longer trusted silence. "Or they're working," Grayson replied. Natalie studied him for a moment, her gaze moving from his face to the uniform, then to Onyx, whose eyes had already settled on her, not threatening, but measuring. "That doesn't look like dock work," she said. "It isn't," Grayson answered. There was no challenge in his tone, no attempt to deflect, and that alone seemed to interest her more than any denial would have. "I'm Natalie Pierce," she said after a brief pause, as if deciding that directness might be the only approach that still worked in this town. "I write for the Gazette." "I know," Grayson said. It was not said as a claim, just a fact. Natalie exhaled quietly, something like confirmation settling into her expression, as if a suspicion she had been holding had just found its shape. "Then you probably know why I'm here," she said. Grayson did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked past her, toward the Marina Road where a truck idled longer than necessary before pulling away, his eyes following it just long enough to mark the detail before returning to her. "You've been tracking the land sales," he said, It was not a question. Natalie nodded once. For months, she replied. At first it looked clean. Too clean. Prices below market, but not enough to raise alarms. Contracts filed quickly. No disputes on record. She hesitated briefly, then added, but people don't leave like that. Not all at once. Not without something pushing them. Grayson said nothing, because he already knew. I tried talking to some of them, she continued, her voice lowering slightly as if the open air itself could still carry unwanted attention. Most wouldn't say anything. A few hinted, pressure, visits, warnings that didn't sound like warnings. Her eyes flicked toward him again. And then there's the sheriff. At the mention of that word, Onyx shifted almost imperceptibly, his ears angling toward the distant road, as if the name itself had weight. Grayson's expression did not change, but his attention sharpened. Nolan Briggs, Natalie said. He's been here almost 30 years. Used to be different from what people say. Fair, reliable. She paused, her jaw tightening slightly. Now he looks the other way. Reports disappear. Complaints don't get filed. And when things get physical, like yesterday, he shows up just long enough to calm things down without actually doing anything. Grayson nodded once. He had seen that pattern before. Different places, same shape. You're not from here, Natalie said, watching him carefully. No, Grayson replied. But you're not passing through either. No. There was a brief silence between them, not uncomfortable, but weighted, as if both understood that whatever came next would move beyond casual conversation. You saw what happened, she said finally. Grayson looked back toward the diner, visible down the street, its windows catching dull reflections of the sky. Yes. And you're not going to ignore it. It was not phrased as a question. Grayson met her gaze. No. Something in Natalie's expression shifted then, not relief, not quite trust, but something close enough to both that it did not need to be named. I've got records, she said. Contracts, property transfers, names that keep showing up where they shouldn't. She hesitated briefly, then added, but I can't prove coercion. Not without someone willing to stand up. Grayson glanced down briefly at Onyx, whose gaze had returned to the harbor. Calm, but aware. Then back to Natalie. You don't need everyone, he said. Just enough. Natalie gave a small, humorless smile. In this town, she said. That's the hard part. Behind them, another figure approached along the dock, slower this time, heavier steps, and when Grayson turned, he saw a man in his late 50s, broad-shouldered but worn down by years of labor, his jacket faded, his hands rough and marked by old injuries that never fully healed. His name was Carl Benson, a former dock supervisor who had once owned a small stretch of shoreline before selling it under circumstances he rarely discussed, and though he carried himself with the quiet caution of someone who had learned from experience, there was something else beneath it now. Something unresolved. Carl stopped a short distance away, his eyes moving between Grayson and Natalie. You're asking questions again, he said to Natalie, his voice low, not accusing, but not approving either. Someone has to, she replied. Carl let out a slow breath, glancing briefly toward the road before lowering his voice further. Questions get noticed, he said, and around here that's not a good thing. Grayson stepped slightly forward, not aggressively, but enough to bring himself into the center of the exchange. Then maybe it's time they are, he said. Carl studied him for a long moment, taking in the uniform, the posture, the stillness that did not belong to uncertainty. And something in his expression shifted, not into agreement, but into consideration. You don't know how this works, Carl said quietly. Grayson held his gaze. I do, he replied. And in that moment, the difference between knowing and accepting became clear, because Carl looked away first. The wind moved across the harbor again, carrying the sound of distant engines, gulls circling overhead, the steady rhythm of water against wood, and somewhere beyond the docks, unseen but present, the system that had shaped Greyport continued its quiet operation. But now, it was no longer unobserved, because pieces had begun to come together. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough. The harbor did not sleep the way people did. It simply changed its rhythm, trading the noise of daylight labor for something quieter, more deliberate, and far more revealing to those who knew how to listen. Because at night, Greyport's truth moved without disguise, slipping between shadows cast by dock lights and the slow breathing of the tide. By the time the last of the fishermen had tied their lines and the casual traffic along the waterfront had thinned to near silence, the docks became a place of patterns rather than activity, where every movement meant something and every absence meant even more. Grayson Hale had already learned enough to know that watching from a distance would not be enough, so he worked. By day, he moved among the dockhands as one of them, carrying crates, coiling ropes, guiding small vessels into place with the steady precision of someone who understood balance and weight instinctively. He did not speak more than necessary, did not ask questions that would linger too long in another man's thoughts. And over time, the others began to accept his presence not because they trusted him, but because he gave them no reason not to. The green of his Navy SEAL uniform drew occasional glances at first, but in a place where people had learned not to stare, even that became just another detail absorbed into the background. Among the workers was a man named Eli Turner, a wiry dockhand in his early 40s whose sunburned skin and narrow frame told the story of a life spent outdoors. His movements quick but economical. His eyes sharp in a way that suggested he noticed more than he ever said. Eli had grown up in Greyport, had never left, and had learned over time that survival in a small town depended less on strength than on knowing when to remain invisible. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was with a dry, understated humor that seemed to soften the edges of a place that had grown too rigid. "You don't talk much," Eli said one afternoon as they worked side by side securing a line to a cleat worn smooth by decades of use. Grayson tightened the knot with a practiced motion. "Talking doesn't move the work," he replied. Eli gave a small nod, as if that answer fit neatly into the category of things he could accept without further examination. "No," he said, "but sometimes it tells you where the work's going." Grayson did not respond, because he was already watching. Onyx lay nearby, his body relaxed against the weathered wood of the dock. But his eyes never truly rested, tracking movement across the harbor with a quiet vigilance that required no instruction. The German Shepherd had adapted quickly to the environment, learning the difference between ordinary motion and something that did not belong, his ears lifting subtly at certain sounds, his posture shifting just enough to signal awareness without drawing attention. And it was Onyx who noticed first. The trucks came in the late afternoon at first, rolling slowly along the Marina Road before stopping near the older storage sheds at the far end of the docks, where fewer workers passed and fewer questions were asked. They carried no company markings, their surfaces clean in a way that stood out against the salt-worn vehicles common to the harbor, and their drivers rarely left the cab for long, stepping out only to exchange brief words with men who did not appear to be dock workers. Grayson saw them, but Onyx watched them. The dog's ears would lift each time the engines approached, his head turning slightly, his gaze following the vehicles until they disappeared again. And though he made no sound, the tension in his body spoke clearly enough. Not normal. By evening, the pattern became clearer. The trucks returned. Not every night, but often enough to establish rhythm, and always to the same place. Grayson adjusted his routine without drawing attention, taking on shifts that placed him closer to that section of the docks as the light began to fade, working later than most, lingering just long enough to observe without being observed, and when the final workers left and the harbor settled into its quieter state, he remained. The first night he followed the pattern fully, the air was colder, the wind sharper off the water, carrying with it the low, constant sound of waves striking wood and the distant call of gulls settling along the shoreline. The dock lights cast long, uneven shadows across the planks, leaving pockets of darkness between them that felt deeper than they should have been. Onyx moved beside him without a leash, his steps silent despite his size, his body low and controlled, as if he understood the nature of the moment without needing to be told. From a position behind stacked crates near the edge of the storage area, Grayson watched. The trucks arrived just after nightfall. 2 of them. Their engines idled briefly before cutting off, and within minutes, figures emerged from the shadows, not rushing, not hesitating, moving with the kind of efficiency that suggested repetition rather than improvisation. There were 4 men in total, their clothing plain but deliberate, jackets pulled close against the cold, hats low over their faces. And though they did not speak loudly, their movements carried the confidence of people who did not expect interruption. Crates were unloaded, not large, not heavy, but handled with care. And then came the exchanges. Envelopes passed from one hand to another, small, unmarked, but carried with enough intention to make their contents obvious. And at one point, one of the men opened a case just long enough for Grayson to see inside. Rows of documents stacked neatly, bound and sealed. The kind of paperwork that did not belong on a dock in the middle of the night. Onyx shifted slightly beside him, his muscles tightening, his gaze fixed on one of the men whose posture suggested something different from the others. Not in authority, but in awareness, as if he was used to watching as much as acting. Grayson noted him, because patterns were built on details. And this was no longer suspicion. This was confirmation. The trucks left within minutes, their engines low as they pulled away into the darkness, leaving behind only the echo of movement and the faint imprint of something that did not belong to legitimate work. Grayson remained still for several seconds after they were gone, allowing the space to settle, ensuring no one lingered unseen. And only then did he move, stepping out from behind the crates with the same measured control he had maintained all night. Onyx followed. The dog paused briefly near the area where the exchanges had taken place, his nose lowering toward the ground, drawing in the scent, processing it, committing it to memory, before lifting his head again, his ears turning toward the distant road, as if tracking the trucks long after they had disappeared. Grayson looked out across the harbor. What had once been a quiet coastal town now revealed itself as something else entirely, a place where intimidation was only the surface layer, where beneath it operated a system that required coordination, secrecy, and protection. Because none of this could exist without someone allowing it. And in Grayport, that someone wore a badge. The wind moved across the water again, colder now, sharper, carrying with it the quiet certainty that whatever had been hidden here was no longer invisible. Because someone had finally taken the time to see it. Night did not fall gently over Grayport that evening. It pressed down with a quiet insistence, the kind that carried weight in the air and settled into the spaces between buildings, along the narrow streets, across the docks, and into the cedar walls of homes that had stood too long against too many storms. The wind came sharper than usual, rattling loose boards and whispering through the trees near the shoreline, and the ocean beyond the dark horizon moved with a restless rhythm, as if something beneath it had been disturbed and had not yet settled. At the Hale House, the lights burned low. The structure itself stood as it always had, weathered cedar facing the sea, its narrow porch stretching toward the water like a memory refusing to fade, and inside, Lorraine Hale moved slowly through the familiar space, her steps careful but steady, the mark along her cheek now softened into a faint shadow, though not yet gone. She carried herself as she always had, with quiet dignity, but something beneath that calm had shifted, not into fear, but into awareness, the kind that came when a line had been crossed and could not be ignored. Grayson stood near the window, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the glass, the green of his Navy SEAL uniform catching faint reflections from the room behind him. And beside the door, Onyx lay stretched along the wooden floor, his body still, his breathing slow, yet his ears remained alert, turning occasionally toward sounds too distant for most to notice. Neither of them spoke, because silence, when understood properly, carried more information than conversation ever could. Hours passed without incident. The house remained quiet, the wind steady, the world outside seemingly unchanged, and yet the tension did not leave. It only deepened, settling into the structure of the night itself. Then Onyx moved. It was not sudden, not dramatic, but immediate. His body rising in one fluid motion, his head turning toward the front of the house, ears forward, muscles tightening beneath his coat as a low vibration formed in his chest. Not yet a growl, but close enough to one that the difference no longer mattered. Grayson turned before the sound fully formed. He had already read the shift. Outside, beyond the porch, something moved. Not loudly, not carelessly, but wrong. The gravel along the narrow path leading to the house shifted under weight that did not belong to the wind, footsteps measured but cautious, as if whoever approached understood the need for quiet, but not enough to avoid detection entirely. Lorraine looked up from where she sat, her eyes moving toward Grayson, and though she did not speak, the question was there. Grayson gave a small nod. Stay. He moved toward the door. Onyx was already there. Grayson opened it slowly, just enough to step outside, the cold air hitting immediately, sharp against his face, carrying the scent of salt, wood, and something else beneath it, something human, unfamiliar, and deliberate. 3 figures stood near the edge of the porch. Darius Crow was at the front. He looked different in the dark, less controlled, his heavy frame outlined by the faint light spilling from the doorway, his expression tighter, the confidence he carried in daylight now edged with something harder, something closer to urgency. Behind him stood 2 other men, both dressed in dark jackets, their faces partially obscured, their posture uncertain in a way that suggested they were not accustomed to this kind of work, hired muscle rather than practiced enforcers. Darius stepped forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Grayson. "Evening," he said, his voice lower than before, stripped of its earlier performance. Grayson said nothing. Onyx stepped forward half a pace, his body aligned with Grayson's, his gaze fixed not on Darius's face, but on his hands, watching, waiting. Darius noticed. Of course he did. His eyes flicked briefly toward the dog, then back. "You should have kept walking when you came into town," he said. "Would have been easier." Grayson remained still. The wind moved between them, carrying the tension like a current. "This isn't your business," Darius continued, though the certainty in his tone had begun to thin. "You don't understand how things work here." Grayson took a single step forward, closing the distance just enough to shift the balance of the space. "I do," he said quietly. The words did not rise. They did not need to. Behind Darius, one of the men shifted his weight, his stance uncertain, his eyes moving toward the trees as if expecting something to emerge from them, while the other kept his hands close to his sides. Too close. The outline beneath his jacket suggesting the presence of a weapon he was not yet ready to use. Onyx's body tensed. Grayson saw it. The moment stretched. Then it broke. Darius moved first, not with the clean intent of a trained strike, but with the force of frustration, stepping forward with a sudden lunge meant to overwhelm rather than outmaneuver, his size driving the motion forward. Grayson met it without hesitation. The movement was controlled, precise, his body shifting just enough to redirect the force, his hands guiding rather than resisting, turning Darius's momentum against him and bringing him down hard onto the gravel with a force that knocked the air from his lungs. The second man reacted too late. His hand moved toward his jacket. Onyx was already there. The German shepherd surged forward in a blur of motion, not wild, not uncontrolled, but exact. His teeth finding fabric and pressure point in a single, decisive action that stopped the movement before it could complete. His body low, his weight driving forward just enough to hold, not to harm beyond necessity. The third man froze. Completely. Because whatever he had expected, it had not been this. Grayson stood over Darius, one hand holding him in place, not striking, not escalating, but making it clear that further resistance would change the outcome in ways none of them would control. "Leave," Grayson said. The word was simple, final. The man Onyx held let out a strained breath, his body going still, his hands raised slightly in a silent signal of surrender, while the third man took a step back, then another, his courage already gone. Darius struggled once, then stopped, because he understood. Not fully, but enough. Grayson released him. Onyx withdrew immediately, returning to Grayson's side without command, his posture settling, though his eyes remained locked on the men, ready if needed. Darius pushed himself up slowly, his expression no longer confident, no longer controlled, but something closer to anger held in check by something stronger than pride. "This isn't over," he muttered. Grayson did not respond, because it never was. The three men backed away, their steps uneven now, their presence no longer dominating the space, but retreating from it, and within moments, they were gone, swallowed by the darkness they had come from. The wind moved again. The night settled. Grayson stood for a moment longer, his gaze following where they had disappeared, measuring distance, timing, possibility, and beside him, Onyx remained still, his ears tracking the fading sound of footsteps until they disappeared completely. Inside, Lorraine had not moved from her chair. When Grayson stepped back into the house, she looked at him, her expression calm, but her eyes sharper now, clearer. "They won't stop," she said. Grayson closed the door. "No," he replied. And for the first time, Grayport's silence did not feel like control. It felt like something waiting to break. Morning did not arrive with light so much as it arrived with clarity, the kind that follows a night where something has shifted beyond return. And in Grayport, that shift did not announce itself with noise, but with the subtle tightening of attention in the air. The way doors opened a little slower, the way people lingered a second longer on their porches, as if waiting to see whether the quiet they had known would hold or finally break. The sky stretched pale above the harbor, the clouds thinner now, the wind still present but less insistent, carrying with it the scent of salt and something sharper beneath it, something that felt like change. At the Hale house, Grayson Hale had been awake long before dawn, seated at the kitchen table with a small laptop open before him, the screen casting a muted glow across the surface of the wood, and beside him, Onyx lay still, his body relaxed in appearance, but attentive in detail, ears shifting occasionally toward the open window where the early air moved gently through the room. The events of the previous night had not lingered as emotion, but as data, as pieces of a larger structure that had now revealed enough of itself to be understood. Grayson worked without hesitation. The files he had gathered over the past days, images of trucks, movements, exchanges, the pattern of arrivals and departures, the faces caught in low light, the timing that aligned too precisely to be coincidence. All of it was organized, refined, and prepared for transmission, not as speculation, but as evidence. There was no rush in his movements, only efficiency. The kind that came from knowing that once something was set in motion, it could not be recalled. When he finished, he sent it. Not to anyone local, not to anyone who could be influenced, but beyond Grayport, to a system that did not belong to the town's silence. The message was brief. The attachments were not. And when it was done, Grayson closed the laptop, the quiet click of the device sealing something that had been building long before he had arrived. Lorraine Hale moved slowly into the kitchen, her presence soft but steady, her silver hair catching the early light as she took her seat across from him, her eyes moving briefly toward the screen, then back to his face. "You've done what you needed to do," she said. It was not a question. Grayson nodded once. "Yes." Lorraine studied him for a moment, then looked past him, toward the window, where the harbor lay calm in appearance, its surface reflecting the pale sky as if nothing beneath it stirred. "Then now we wait," she said. Grayson did not answer, because waiting, in his world, was never passive. Across town, Sheriff Nolan Briggs stood on the porch of his office, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, his broad frame slightly stooped as if the years had begun to settle more heavily on him than before. He was 60, his hair graying at the temples, his uniform still pressed but worn in ways that spoke of long service rather than pride. And to those who did not look closely, he appeared exactly as a sheriff should, steady, reliable, present. But those who looked closer saw the hesitation. The way his eyes moved not with confidence, but with calculation. The way his posture shifted when certain names were mentioned. The way his silence had become more frequent than his decisions. Inside his office, the phone rang. He let it ring once, twice. Then he answered. The voice on the other end was controlled, direct, carrying none of the uncertainty that had become common in Greyport. Nolan listened, and as he did, the weight he had been carrying shifted into something heavier, something undeniable. Understood, he said finally, his voice quieter than before. When he hung up, the coffee in his hand had gone cold. He did not drink it, because for the first time in a long while, he understood that the system he had allowed, protected, justified, was no longer contained within the boundaries of the town, and that meant it was no longer his to manage. By mid-morning, the first signs appeared. Not loud, not obvious, but present. Unmarked vehicles moved through Greyport's streets, their presence subtle but deliberate, parking where they needed to, not drawing attention, yet impossible to ignore for those who knew what to look for. At the marina, Eli Turner noticed them first, his sharp eyes catching the difference in movement, the way these newcomers observed rather than belonged, and he said nothing, but his posture changed, his attention narrowing, because men like him survived by recognizing shifts before they became events. Natalie Pierce stood near the Gazette office, a folder held tightly in her hands, her gaze fixed on the vehicles as they passed. And though she had spent months chasing a story she could not fully prove, something in her expression now carried the quiet realization that the story had moved beyond her. She turned and walked, not toward the office, but toward the harbor, because she knew where to find him. Grayson stood where she expected, near the docks, the wind moving lightly around him, Onyx at his side, both of them still, both of them watching. "It's happening," she said as she approached, her voice controlled but edged with something that had not been there before. Grayson nodded. "Yes." Natalie exhaled, her grip tightening briefly on the folder before easing again. "I didn't think it would move this fast," she admitted. "It didn't," Grayson replied. "It's been moving for a long time." She looked at him, understanding settling into her expression in a way that did not require further explanation. Across town, Darius Crowe did not have the same clarity. He was standing beside his truck when the first agents approached, their movements coordinated, their presence calm but absolute. And though he turned with the same confidence he had carried into the diner days before, that confidence fractured the moment he realized these men were not part of Greyport's system. They did not hesitate. They did not negotiate. And for the first time, Darius Crowe found himself on the receiving end of something he could not intimidate. The same was true for Everett Sloan. He was taken from his office with the same precision, his composed exterior holding just long enough to suggest control, before the reality of the situation began to settle into the lines of his face, the understanding that whatever he had built in Greyport had extended beyond its boundaries in ways he could no longer contain. And Sheriff Nolan Briggs stood on his porch when they came for him. He did not run. He did not argue. Because somewhere between the phone call and the arrival of those vehicles, he had already understood that the silence he had relied on had finally broken. By afternoon, Greyport was no longer quiet in the same way. People spoke, carefully at first, then more openly. The names that had once been avoided moved through conversations without hesitation, the fear that had shaped every interaction beginning to loosen its hold, not gone, not completely, but weakened in a way that made something else possible. At the Hale house, Lorraine stood near the window once more, her gaze resting on the harbor, her expression calm, though something beneath it had changed. Not relief, not triumph, but a quiet release of something she had carried for too long. Grayson stood behind her, his presence as steady as it had been since his arrival, and Onyx lay at her feet, his body finally at rest in a way that suggested the tension had eased, at least for now. "It's over," Lorraine said softly. Grayson looked out at the water. "No," he replied. "But it started. And sometimes, that was enough." The morning that followed did not feel like a victory. Not in the way stories often try to describe such things, because Greyport did not wake to celebration or relief loud enough to echo across the harbor. Instead, it woke slowly, cautiously, as if the town itself was unsure whether it was allowed to breathe differently now, whether the weight that had pressed down on it for so long had truly lifted or merely shifted out of sight. The sky stretched clearer than it had in days, pale blue breaking through the gray that had lingered too long above the water. And the wind, though still present, no longer carried the same sharp edge, moving instead with a steadier rhythm that felt less like pressure and more like motion. Along the main street, doors opened earlier than usual. People stepped outside not with urgency, but with curiosity, lingering on porches, pausing beside trucks, glancing toward one another with expressions that held something unfamiliar, something cautious, but growing. Like the first moment after a storm when silence no longer means danger, but possibility. Conversations began in fragments, short exchanges that tested the space between fear and honesty. And though voices remained low, they no longer dropped to whispers when certain names were spoken, because those names no longer held the same power. At Harbor Diner, the bell above the door rang more often that morning, customers arriving not only for food, but for something harder to define. A need to be among others, to confirm that what had happened was real, that the silence had truly broken. Megan Brooks moved behind the counter with a steadiness that felt different from before, her shoulders no longer carrying the same invisible tension, her voice a little clearer as she greeted each person who entered. She still worked with the same care, the same quiet efficiency, but now there was something else beneath it, something that had been held back too long and had finally found space to exist. At one of the tables, Harold Finch sat with his coffee, his weathered hands wrapped around the mug as they always were. But this time, when another man mentioned Everett Sloane's name, he did not lower his gaze. He nodded. Slowly, as if acknowledging something that had been true all along. Across town, the Gazette office was alive with movement, papers spread across desks, phones ringing, voices overlapping as Natalie Pierce moved between conversations, her expression focused, but no longer strained in the same way. She had spent months chasing a story that no one wanted to confirm, building pieces that refused to form a complete picture, and now that picture had finally emerged. Not because she forced it into existence, but because enough people had stopped looking away. Her auburn hair was pulled back loosely, strands escaping as she worked, her gray eyes sharp with purpose. But there was a quiet steadiness beneath that focus now, the kind that came from knowing that the truth, once spoken, could not be easily buried again. Not everything had been saved. That truth moved through the town as well, softer, less spoken, but present in the way certain houses stood empty, their windows dark, their porches untouched. The families who had once lived there gone long before anyone had found the courage to resist. Those losses did not vanish with the arrests. They remained, like scars beneath the surface. Reminders that silence had cost more than anyone had wanted to admit. But the difference now was that those losses were no longer ignored. They were seen. They were named. And that changed what came next. At the edge of the harbor, the Hale house stood as it always had, its weathered cedar catching the morning light, the ocean stretching beyond it in long, steady lines of movement. And on the narrow porch, Lorraine Hale stood with one hand resting lightly against the railing, her gaze fixed on the water that had been part of her life for longer than she could remember. The faint mark along her cheek had nearly faded, leaving behind only a trace. But the moment it represented had not disappeared. It had simply settled into something quieter, something understood. She did not look like someone who had won. She looked like someone who had endured. and that, in its own way, was more lasting. Behind her, the door opened softly. Grayson Hale stepped out, the green of his Navy SEAL uniform catching the light just enough to stand out against the muted tones of the house, though he carried himself the same as always, without need for recognition, without expectation of acknowledgement. His presence did not fill the space. It simply existed within it, steady, controlled, complete. Onyx followed, his large frame moving easily across the wooden boards, his posture relaxed in a way it had not been before, though his eyes still moved, still tracked, still held that quiet awareness that defined him. The German shepherd paused beside Lorraine, lowering himself near her feet, his body settling into the warmth of the morning, though his ears continued to shift with distant sounds, a habit that would not leave him, even now. Lorraine glanced down at him, her hand resting briefly against his back, fingers brushing through his coat with a familiarity that needed no words. Then she looked toward Grayson. "You're leaving," she said. It was not a question. Grayson stepped beside her, his gaze moving out across the water. Yes. There was no hesitation in the answer, because there never was. Lorraine nodded once, her expression unchanged, though something softer moved beneath it. Not sadness, not quite pride, but something that belonged to both. "You always do," she said. Grayson did not reply, because some truths did not require confirmation. The wind moved gently across the porch, carrying with it the scent of salt and the distant sound of the harbor waking fully now. Engines starting, voices carrying farther than they had before. The town stepping into a day that felt different, not because it was perfect, but because it was no longer controlled by what it refused to say. Onyx lifted his head briefly, his gaze shifting toward the road as if sensing what came next before it happened. Then he stood, his body aligning naturally beside Grayson, ready without being told. Grayson turned slightly, his attention moving from the water back to the house, to Lorraine, to the place that had shaped more of him than he would ever explain. "It'll hold," he said. Lorraine followed his gaze, then looked back at him. "It will," she agreed, because now it could. Grayson stepped down from the porch, his movements quiet, measured, and Onyx followed immediately, the two of them moving together without need for direction, their pace steady as they crossed the short path toward the road where a truck waited, dusted lightly with salt from the air. Lorraine remained where she was, watching, not calling out, not stopping him, because she understood something that Grayport had only just begun to learn, that some people were not meant to stay. They were meant to arrive, to change what needed to be changed, and then to leave, before the place they had altered could try to hold them. Grayson reached the truck and paused for a moment, his hand resting briefly against the door before opening it, and as he did, Onyx leaped easily into the passenger seat, settling into place with a quiet readiness that had not faded, only softened. The engine started. The sound carried across the morning air, blending with the life of the town that had begun to move again, and as the truck pulled away, it did not draw attention, did not leave behind anything visible, only the space it had occupied moments before. On the porch, Lorraine stood a while longer, her gaze following the road until it curved out of sight. Then she turned back toward the house, toward the harbor, toward the town that had begun, finally, to find its voice again. Because Grayport had not been saved by force alone. It had been changed by something quieter, by a refusal, by a moment, by the simple decision, made by one person, then another, to no longer remain silent. And as the sun rose higher over the water, casting light across the docks, the streets, the houses, the empty spaces, and the lives that filled them, Grayport did something it had not done in a long time. It breathed freely.